Nashville, Tennessee, October 31st, 1960, 9 in the morning. RCA Studio B on 17th Avenue, the same studio where Elvis had recorded some of the biggest hits of his career. The same room where the hits that paid for everything, the label's offices, the producers' salaries, the machinery of an industry had been made. Elvis Presley is sitting across a table from three men who control that machinery. He has been back from the army for 8 months. In those 8 months, he has recorded It's Now or Never and Are You Lonesome Tonight, and a dozen other songs that have gone straight to #1. He is 25 years old, and he is the most commercially successful recording artist in the world. And the three men across the table know this as well as he does, which is why what he says next surprises them. I want to record a gospel album, Elvis says. The room is quiet for a moment. Not a Christmas album, not a song or two with spiritual themes, a full album, all gospel. Nothing else. The executive at the center of the table, Steve Sholes, the man who had signed Elvis to RCA in 1955 for the then extraordinary sum of $35,000, looks at the man sitting across from him. He looks at the man who has made that investment return 100-fold. He looks at the most bankable name in American music, and he says, Elvis. That would be a mistake. To understand why RCA was afraid, you have to understand what gospel music meant in 1960. Gospel was not crossover. Gospel was not mainstream. Gospel was the music of churches and revivals and Sunday mornings in communities that the mainstream music industry did not believe constituted a commercial market. The people who bought gospel records were not the people who bought Elvis records, that was the assumption, stated plainly in label meetings, written into the calculations that determined what got recorded and what did not. Elvis Presley had been built on a very specific audience: teenagers, young people, the generation that had discovered rock and roll as their own private language, the generation that had claimed Elvis as their emblem. That audience was enormous, and it was loyal, and it was profitable. And the men in that meeting believed, with the confidence of people who had been right about commercial music for a long time, that gospel would lose it. Your audience doesn't want gospel, Sholes told Elvis. They want what you've been giving them. They want the hits. Elvis looked at him. He did not argue. He did not raise his voice. The people who knew him well recognized this particular stillness, the stillness that preceded a decision that had already been made, a decision that no amount of label logic was going to undo. You don't understand, Elvis said. I'm not doing this for the audience. Then what are you doing it for? Sholes asked. Elvis looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked up. I'm doing it for myself, he said. I've been singing gospel since I was a child. It's the music that made me. And I'm going to record it. The meeting ended without resolution. Sholes spoke to Colonel Parker. Parker spoke to Elvis. Parker's position was predictable and consistent. He saw the album as a commercial risk and said so in the direct language he always used when money was the subject. The fans want rock and roll, Parker said. Give them gospel, and you'll lose them. Elvis listened to everything the colonel said. He listened with the patience of someone who has learned, over years, exactly how much weight to give each voice in the room. Then, he booked Studio B for the first weekend of November. What happened in that studio over those 2 days in early November of 1960 is one of the most significant recording events in American music history, and one of the least discussed. Elvis arrived on Friday morning with a list of songs. Not the kind of list his producers usually saw carefully market-tested selections, demos from established songwriters, material chosen for its commercial potential. This list was different. These were songs he had known since childhood, songs from the Assembly of God Church in East Tupelo, where his family had worshipped when there was nothing else to rely on. Songs that had been in his life longer than the fame, longer than the records, longer than anyone in that studio except Elvis himself knew anything about him. He handed the list to his producer, Chet Atkins. Atkins looked at it for a moment. Then he said, "Let's go." The musicians who were present for those sessions described what happened with a consistency that is itself remarkable. Different people, different interviews, different decades, and they all describe the same thing. They describe a recording session unlike any other they had been part of. Not because of the technical quality of what was being recorded, though that was extraordinary, but because of the atmosphere in the room. Elvis was different in those sessions, said pianist Floyd Kramer, who had played on dozens of Elvis recordings. Every session we did, he was professional. He was good. He worked hard. But these sessions, he was somewhere else. He wasn't performing. He wasn't thinking about the charts or the label or any of that. He was just inside the music, completely inside it. What Kramer was describing was someone recording not for an audience, but for something older and more personal than any audience. Elvis had learned these songs before he knew what a recording studio was. He had sung them in a church with no air conditioning in the Mississippi summer, in a congregation that had nothing but the music and the belief that the music represented. He had sung them with his mother, who had held his hand in the pew and closed her eyes and swayed to the rhythm of something that existed long before Elvis Presley was famous. Gladys had been dead for 2 years when he recorded that album. The musicians noticed something else. Between takes, Elvis would sometimes stop and talk about specific songs, where he had first heard them, what they meant to him, what it felt like to sing them. This was unusual. Elvis was not typically a man who explained himself in the studio. He worked intuitively. He responded to what he heard in the playback. He made adjustments without extensive discussion. But with these songs, he talked. He told Chet Atkins about the church in Tupelo. He told Floyd Kramer about singing with his mother. He told the background singers, the Jordanaires, who had been with him since the mid-50s, that he had been waiting to record these songs for years and had not known how to make it happen. The Jordanaires understood. They had grown up in the same tradition. They knew what it meant to sing this music, not as performance, but as testimony. The album was recorded in a single weekend. On Sunday evening, Elvis and the musicians gathered in the control room to hear the playback of everything they had recorded. The producer ran the tape. The songs filled the room. In My Father's House, Working on the Building, Swing Down, Sweet Chariot, His Hand in Mine. When the playback ended, nobody spoke for a long moment. Then Elvis said, quietly, "That's the one. That's the record." He was right. His Hand in Mine was released in November of 1960. The label's expectations were modest. They had been overruled on the project, and they had prepared themselves for a commercial disappointment. They had their contingency plans, their explanations ready for when the sales failed to materialize. The sales did not fail to materialize. The album sold 300,000 copies in its first month. It went to number 13 on the Billboard pop charts, an almost unheard of achievement for a gospel album at that time. It reached number 1 on the gospel charts, where it stayed for a year. It became, and remains, one of the best-selling gospel albums in American music history. The label executives called a meeting to discuss the results. Elvis did not attend. He was in the studio, recording his next album. But here is the part of the story that the sales figures cannot capture. Here is the part that matters more than the charts. In the months after His Hand in Mine was released, Elvis began receiving a different kind of mail. Not the fan letters he had been receiving since 1956, the declarations of love, the requests for photographs, the missives from teenagers who had claimed him as their own. Different letters. Letters from people who had grown up in the same tradition he had. Letters from people who had lost faith and found it again through his recording. Letters from people who said the album had reached them somewhere the rock and roll records never could. Elvis kept these letters separately from the others. The people around him noticed this. He didn't talk about it directly. He was not a man who spoke openly about his faith, who performed his spirituality for public consumption, but he kept the letters. And sometimes, when he was in the music room at Graceland late at night, he would take them out and read them. He recorded 2 more gospel albums over the course of his career. How Great Thou Art in 1967 won him his first Grammy Award. He's The Light of My World was recorded in the early 70s and is among his most powerful vocal performances. He never stopped fighting for the right to record them. Every album required a version of the same. Conversation with the label, with the Colonel, with the commercial machinery that saw gospel as a detour from the profitable main road of his career. And every time, Elvis had the same response. "This music was here before the fame," he said once, in an interview that is rarely quoted. "It will be here after. I'm not going to pretend it doesn't exist because it makes some people uncomfortable." The people in that first meeting in 1960, the men who told Elvis that gospel would ruin his career, were wrong in the most complete way it is possible to be wrong. Wrong about the commercial reality, wrong about the audience, wrong about what Elvis was and where he had come from and what he needed to express. But more than that, they were wrong about what music is for. Music is not only for audiences. Sometimes music is for the person making it. Sometimes it is the only honest language available for something that cannot be said any other way. Sometimes it is a conversation with someone who is no longer there to hear it in person. Elvis Presley recorded His Hand in Mine 2 years after his mother died. She had held his hand in church. She had sung these songs beside him. She had told him he was destined for something she couldn't name. When he sang In My Father's House in Studio B in November of 1960, with the label executives skeptical and the Colonel counting the commercial risk, he was not performing for any of them. He was singing to her, and the whole world could hear it. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that the things worth fighting for are always the ones someone is telling you to leave behind, please subscribe and share it. Drop a comment below. What is your favorite Elvis gospel song? And have you ever fought to keep something that mattered to you when everyone around you said let it go? The notification bell is right there. Ring it, because the music that costs something to make is always the music that lasts.